Welcome to Aging Insights. I'm Melissa Chalker, Executive Director of the New Jersey Foundation for Aging. The Foundation's mission is to enable seniors to live with independence and dignity in their communities. Aging Insights is produced by the New Jersey Foundation for Aging to provide information and resources to boomers, seniors, and caregivers. In the wintertime, things can be dark, cold, and lonely. Maybe we don't get out as much anymore. Perhaps a health condition, trouble walking, loss of hearing, or fear of driving keeps us home more, isolated from our friends, family, community, and activities. We want to spend some time today talking about social isolation, how it happens, who it happens to, the consequences of it, and of course, how to address it with solutions. My guest today is Allison Thomas Cottingham, who is a professor of psychology at Rider University and a researcher at Sabre 88. Thank you so much, Allison, for joining me today. I'm really glad to have you, and I wanted to start out by you just introducing yourself and give us a little bit background about your work and what you do.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Melissa. And so, as you said, I'm Allison Thomas Cottingham. I am a faculty member in the psychology department at Rider University. At Rider, I teach a variety of courses. I teach abnormal psychology, personality, and a class called psychology and aging. I'm also a researcher at Sabre 88, which is in Newark, New Jersey. And at Sabre 88, I run a project called Project 65 Plus. And Project 65 Plus allows me to explore my interest in successful aging among older adults. And one of the things that I've done through 65 Plus over the past 3 years is I've visited senior centers in New Jersey throughout the state, and I provide educational lectures about topics that include dating, sexual health, grieving, and social relationships.
I think that's really great that you're not only using this information that you have to teach the future generations of healthcare professionals who will need to learn how to deal with a growing older adult population, but you're also connecting directly with seniors and providing them with information and then using that to inform what you do going forward. So I think it's really great that you're here with us today to give us some of that knowledge that you're sharing with these other groups as well. So as you probably know, research has shown that social isolation can really be detrimental to someone's health. And so can you explain to us a little bit of why that is, and especially how it affects older adults?
Well, so we know that social isolation is as detrimental to older adults' health as smoking, being obese, or being physically inactive. We also know that older adults who report being socially isolated are more likely to die sooner than older adults who do not report being lonely. Older adults who report being lonely or socially isolated also are more likely to see declines in mobility and also are more at risk for mental health issues like depression.
Right. I think it's so important for us to bring this into the awareness and let people know that, this may be why they're experiencing or feeling that way and how it can be bad for their health. And so we've talked about why it's bad, but we haven't really told people what social isolation is. So maybe we could back up a little bit and explain that to folks, give them a definition.
Certainly. So social isolation is, it's interesting because people talk about it, but we are not quite always on the same page. And so when we look at the research, researchers typically look at social isolation, and there are two components to social isolation. Social isolation. There is social disconnectedness, which is an objective measure, and it is simply the number of contacts and the frequency with which people have social contacts. The other aspect of social isolation is something called perceived isolation, or some people refer to it simply as loneliness. And that's how you feel about your social contacts, whether or not you feel they're adequate, inadequate. So it's a subjective sort of personal assessment of how you feel about your social networks.
So, I mentioned in the opening of the show that if you have a little bit of trouble getting out and you're not feeling as well, that you might not go to as many social events as you used to.
Right.
But just the same, if you're having maybe trouble with your hearing and you're going to the same social events, but you don't feel like you're connecting or communicating with people because you can't hear them, and so conversations are different now. And then is that an example of how someone might feel more of that perceived?
Loneliness, perceived isolation. Yeah. So it's not just the number of, and later on we'll talk about some solutions recommendations and some suggestions. But it's not just the number of contacts or how often, but it's also your perceptions of it. Do you feel like they're meaningful? Do you feel like they fulfill what you need in terms of social connection?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that we're getting all of these definitions out there for folks. You know, we've talked about how it can be detrimental to someone's health to be socially isolated, but as we age, why is it important for us to try to keep those social connections as well?
Well, one of the things we know is as we age, our social networks tend to shrink. So as we age, we retire, and then that work crew, our social networks at work, you know, shrink. As we age, our children move away. As we age, our partners, our friends, our family members pass away. And so as we age, our social circles get smaller and smaller.
So one way we might address that would be to try to increase that social network even as you age, to understand that as things change, that you can't be too old to make new friends, right?
Right, correct. Oh yeah, correct.
And so because we've been focusing on this in terms of the older adult population, why, in addition to the loss you've just talked about and those changes, why else might a senior be more susceptible to social isolation than others? What are their risk factors?
Well, there actually are a number of risk factors. And before I start to talk about the risk factors, I just want to throw out a couple of caveats. One is, when we talk about risk factors, we are talking primarily in terms of relationship, not cause and effect. So just because you have a risk factor does not mean you are going to be socially isolated. Also, there are many risk factors, and I'm going to talk about some, but not all. The other thing to know is just because you experience one risk factor doesn't mean you're going to be socially isolated. So I don't want people to hear us talk about these risk factors and think, oh my goodness, I'm doomed. But there are factors that we know to be related to a higher risk of experiencing social isolation. One is living alone, which makes sense. If you're living alone, you don't have those convenient social connections that people have who live with roommates or partners. Another, interestingly, you mentioned this, is impairment. And so, for example, a person who has we think about a physical impairment. So people who have difficulty with mobility, or people who have sensory impairments may find that they don't venture out as much. So you may have a person who now no longer is able to drive because of possibly visual impairments or other impairments, and so now they're at home and they're not going out as much. Or you may have a person, you mentioned this, a person who has difficulty hearing, who says, you know what, I don't want to go and play bridge with my friends because I can't hear what they're saying. And so it's not enjoyable for me. And so impairments place people at greater risk for social isolation. Another one is low income. Older adults who have limited resources, makes sense, are at greater risk of social isolation. It could be that they have situations where they live in neighborhoods where they have concerns about their safety, and so they don't feel comfortable venturing out because of safety concerns. It could be that they have living conditions where their homes are not handicap accessible, and so they can't go out because it's not easy for them to get out. Another risk factor is geographical location or geographic region in which one lives. We often think about social isolation and we think about rural locations. So we think of older adults who live in rural areas who don't have access to public transportation, and we think of them as being socially isolated. But we also see social isolation among older adults in urban settings. And that can be, again, for the same reasons I mentioned. Maybe my building doesn't have a ramp, and so it's hard for me to get in and out with my wheelchair, or there's no elevator, and walking up and down the stairs is a challenge. And so it's just important to know that social isolation can occur when you are in the midst of many people, as older adults who live in urban neighborhoods can experience social isolation as well.
I think that's a really good point, the difference between isolation because you literally don't live close to anything versus the isolation of I live near stuff but I can't get to it, or I
Right.
don't know how to get to it, or I don't know it's there.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And you mentioned two other things to me that are always the big sticking points, and one obviously is transportation and someone's ability to get somewhere, whether it's in their own car or you. When you mention low income, maybe they don't have enough money for bus fare to get
Right.
somewhere. And as you've said, just because you live in an urban setting doesn't mean that your senior center is close to you and that it would be easy to get to from where you live. So I think that those are really good points that you make about that connectedness that that we need and that we can't always get because of those risk factors. So
Another, and one more risk factor that I want to talk about that people wouldn't think of, but this is an issue as well, being a caregiver. So again, you think if someone is living with someone, then that's a social outlet, right? I live with my spouse and we're together, and so I'm not lonely. But being a caregiver can be incredibly isolating. Caregivers for people with long-term illnesses may feel a sense of, yes, there is a person here with me, but that person's unable to provide social support, or the social contacts that we have are not of the quality that I crave. And so caregivers may find that the only social contacts they have are either with healthcare providers who come in and out to provide services, or they're with family and friends who may visit infrequently, or their visits may be inconsistent. And so people who are caregivers are also at great risk of experiencing social isolation.
another very good point in a population we might not think of when we talk about this. So I think it's great that you bring it up, which takes us to solutions and how do we address social isolation for older adults and caregivers and others who might be at risk?
There are lots of wonderful programs out there to address social isolation. And so I'm going to talk about, before I talk about the programs though, I just want to say there are 3 strategies that are often recommended to address social isolation. And so the older adult who is concerned that they're feeling socially isolated, or maybe they're concerned that a loved one is socially isolated, 3 things to think about. One thing is to try to improve the quality of the social relationships that you have, to increase the frequency of social contacts, and to increase the size of your social networks. So those are 3 things to think about. And like I said, there are a bunch of programs out there. Some programs deal with social isolation on a one-on-one sort of situation. So there are programs where older adults have opportunities to have some sort of meaningful social interaction, one-on-one. Meals on Wheels is a great example of a program that does that. And their tagline, I think, is Meals on Wheels. It's more than just a meal. And when the meal is delivered, it's not just the meal is dropped off and the person leaves, but there then is an opportunity to have a conversation, what's going on in terms of current events, how's the weather, and so that's an opportunity for a one-on-one social interaction for someone who may not otherwise have contact with people.
For those homebound individuals we talked about who don't have the availability to get out, this is someone who's coming to them for the purpose of a meal, but as you said, it can also provide that social interaction.
Right. Another wonderful program is through Contact. Contact of Mercer County offers a program called Reassurance. And that program provides older adults who are homebound, who are living at home and are unable to get out regularly, with a daily phone call. So once a day, they receive a check-in phone call. And again, it's an opportunity to connect with the outside world that's incredibly meaningful. There also are programs for older adults who can get out. AARP offers all sorts of wonderful programs, and they have 2 programs that promote social engagement. One is called Create the Good, which is a program where older adults complete an online survey. They indicate what their skills are, what their interests are, and then based on that information, AARP makes recommendations for good fit volunteer opportunities. So you like to cook and you like to work with children. Oh, there's this great after school program where you can provide after school snacks. There's another program that AARP offers called Experience Corps, where older adults are trained to serve as teachers and mentors for children. And that's a nice program also because it provides intergenerational social engagement, which is really nice. Just a little aside, you know that not everyone, has an opportunity to interact with people of varying ages, and there's such a value in children having chances to interact with older adults. Maybe their grandparents aren't nearby, and older adults interact with children. So it's nice because it's intergenerational. There is a national campaign sponsored by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is called Are You Engaged? Which it's basically a campaign to, again, encourage social engagement. And they recommend all sorts of wonderful things that older adults can do to get themselves out there and to get engaged. They recommend that older adults take classes at a local college. And I know, for example, Rutgers offers, they have a program called the Senior Citizen Audit Program, Senior Citizens Audit Program. And so for adults who are 62 and older, they can audit classes at Rutgers for free. And so again, that's an opportunity to go learn something new, interact with some folks that you may not otherwise have a chance to spend time with. Other suggestions from this campaign from the CDC are things like join a gym, join a book club, find a hobby. Once you find a hobby, then you can find a place where people who engage in that hobby hang out. So I am a knitter. And I know that I can go to any knitting store and find a group of people sitting and knitting, and I can just engage. And, also there are opportunities at your place of worship. So many volunteer opportunities at your place of worship. You can get involved in the musical ministry, or you can get involved in volunteer opportunities. So again, the idea is to increase your social network size, increase the frequency of contacts, and to improve the quality of the relationships that you have.
I think that's all really very comprehensive and good information. And you mentioned some specific programs that are helpful. And I think it's important for us to remind viewers that if that particular program doesn't interest you or it's not available in your area, the main goal there is to reach out to your community and find out what's available. If the gym near you is not to your liking or affordable, check out your senior center, right? Or your Y, or places like that. And if you're not interested in volunteering with children, maybe you could volunteer with other adults or with animals, right? So there are a variety of ways we can do that, because as you said, it's about increasing those contacts. And you can do that at any age, right? You don't have to wait. You can start right now in building that network, so that as things change in your life, you still have those folks that you can reach out to.
There's a wonderful book by John Leland titled Happiness is a Choice You Make, and I have my undergraduates read it. And it is a book, I think it's 2018, it's a relatively new book. John Leland follows a group of older adults. They're the oldest old, so they're 85 and older, who live in New York City. And he chronicles, I want to say like a year in the life of these people. But one of the things that he talks about is things that you can do as a younger person to make sure that your social networks never dwindle to such a point where you don't have anyone. And so he recommends making friends. When you're young, make friends and keep them, knowing that that circle's going to get smaller. And so I think that's a really good point. You're never too young to start.
I often joke with my friends that I'm training now for the New Jersey Senior Olympics, because they won't let me compete until I'm 50, so I'm training now so that I can compete when I'm 50. So that's the goal right there.
Start early.
Start early. But it's, we joke, but it is important for you to find, and not everyone is an outgoing person, not everyone wants a hobby or a sport, but there are other ways to find connections. And the more important thing is that there are resources and people out there who are willing to connect. So what can we as professionals, as advocates, as family members, as friends do to help those people who might not reach out on their own?
I think one of the things that we can do as family members, as advocates, is connect. So, a phone call goes a long way. A text message goes a long way. So making sure that we maintain those connections. And I think also kind of helping people to realize that there are a range of resources. And so we've talked about programs that you can go out into the community and you can do. We've talked about programs where you can sit in your home and you can connect. So I think helping to educate older adults about the resources that do exist, because I don't know if people know. And the winter months are challenging, like you said earlier, because it's cold, it's dark, and it's so much, I don't want to say it's easier, but it's easier to stay at home. It's cozy, it's warm, it's safe, but it's important to connect in some way. And one of the things, something else that, something to think about with the winter months as well is the holidays. And the holidays are also a time when people can start to feel isolated. It was interesting. A few weeks ago, I went to a senior center to talk about the holidays and stress. And one of the women who attended the presentation talked about how she feels isolated in the midst of the dining room with her family because no one talks to her. Her husband has died. Grandma sits in the chair. Everybody kind of moves around her, and she feels isolated. And she's trying to find ways to reach out. So I think it's important to talk about it, to give our family members information, education, and to also reach out.
Sure. And maybe at those holidays, if you notice that an older adult in your family is sitting alone,
yes,
to make conversation,
right,
and maybe not ask the things that everyone else is asking them about their medications or their health.
Right.
Ask them if they watched a good movie recently, or what are they watching on TV? Have they read a good book?
Exactly.
Engage them in a conversation that's meaningful to them, right?
Yes.
I think these are all really great solutions, and I'm glad that you brought up the winter months, because I did want to make sure that we talked about that and how that can be difficult. You also mentioned, and it goes kind of in with the weather and the seasonality of this, you mentioned earlier too that one of the things that can happen to someone who's socially isolated with their health is that it makes them more susceptible to something like depression or other mental health issues. And so we know that there are, in general, stigma with reaching out for help with those things. But in particular for older adults as well, they do still feel somewhat of a stigma in reaching out for help in that area. Is that right?
That is right. Yeah. It's interesting because, again, those who are socially isolated are at increased risk for depression. It's important to say that the majority of older adults are not depressed. It is the most prevalent mental health concern among older adults. But it's interesting because depression is less likely to be detected in older adults than younger adults. Older adults often will think, what I'm feeling is it's just aging. It's normal aging. And so I'm feeling this way, but it's normal aging. Or I'm feeling this way, but I feel this way because of the things that have happened in my life. I've lost a loved one. I live alone. And so they think it's just a reaction to life changes. And so they're less likely to seek mental health care. And so they're less likely to be diagnosed.
So we want them to know, in addition to reaching out for just community, for engagement, for social purposes, that they shouldn't be afraid to also make that call if they're feeling a certain way, because talking to someone or getting help might make a difference in that, even if they feel like it's just normal for them.
Right. Depression is a highly treatable condition. And so, yes, there is a stigma. There continues to be a stigma when we talk about mental health, but conditions can be treated.
I think that's a really great point and a great stopping point for us. I do really appreciate you coming in today and explaining all of this to our viewing audience, and I hope that someone sitting at home watching this feels like it's helpful to them and helps them to engage in their community and make some more meaningful social connections. So thank you for joining me today. And thank all of you for sharing your time with us today as well. Aging Insights is produced by the New Jersey Foundation for Aging and is made possible by donations to the foundation. To become a sponsor for Aging Insights programs, please go to our website at www.njfoundationforaging.org or call us in the office at 609-421-0206. Our previous episodes may be viewed on our website. And we'd also like to remind you that to find out about senior services in your area, you can contact your county office on aging. Their numbers are also on our website, or you can call the state hotline at 1-877-222-3737. Thank you for watching this episode of Aging Insights, and remember, aging is everyone's business.